The morning was quiet. Miss Marple was trimming her roses. She worked carefully, clipping one stem at a time. The village of Street Mary Mead was waking. Shops opening. Milk carts rattling down the lane. The ordinary rhythm of an ordinary day. Then the taxi arrived. Slow. Dust rising on the narrow road. It stopped outside the Blue Boar Inn. A man stepped out. Tall. Neat. Umbrella tucked under his arm. Grey coat brushed clean. His shoes polished. His expression careful. He paid the driver in exact change. No hesitation. No small talk. Just a nod. Miss Marple bent over her rosebush, but her eyes followed him. Old habits. She never missed a detail. The man carried no suitcase, no trunk, no bundle. Only a single object. A thick leather ledger. By afternoon, the village was whispering. Mrs. Bantry's cook said he had asked questions about money at breakfast. The postmistress, Miss Pike, mentioned his sharp eyes always watching, always silent. Mr. Danks, the draper, reported that the man inquired about shop accounts, and Frank Lacey, the carrier, swore the stranger had asked him about late-night deliveries. An accountant, someone said, checking records, tallying debts. But for whom? Miss Marple watered her garden. She listened. She pretended not to care. Inside, she thought carefully. A stranger who counts other people's money is never welcome in a village, especially when that money hides secrets. The widow Hargreaves was the first to bristle. Her late husband had left a tangle of debts. She kept her ledgers under lock and key. She asked Mrs. Dodds at the tier room if the stranger had been snooping. Others grew uneasy. Every household had some detail they preferred to keep quiet. Even Inspector Slack seemed interested. He passed the inn twice that day. He looked, frowned, but did not stop. By evening, the man had made his round of the high street. Always polite, always writing. Ledger open, pencil scratching. He asked about how it is made. Receipts. He asked about accounts. He asked about cash boxes, and he wrote it all down. Miss Marple, walking past with her knitting bag, paused. Her eyes narrowed. She saw what no one else had noticed. The man carried no luggage at all. No spare clothes. No bedding, no personal items, only the ledger. And she wondered, was he guarding it, or was it guarding him? The Blue Boar was busy that afternoon. Rain tapped the windows. The fire burned low. Villagers came and went, some for tea, some only to listen. Mrs. Bantry was already seated. She waved Miss Marple over. "Jane, you've heard, haven't you?" Miss Marple set down her knitting bag. "Heard what, Dolly?" "The stranger, Ellery, that's his name." Bantry lowered her voice. "They say he's auditing the shops, quietly, asking about balances, receipts, even household accounts." Miss Marple stirred her tea, her face mild. Inside, she listened very carefully. Bantry leaned closer. "Mr. Danks is furious, claims his records are perfect." But he looked pale when Ellery pressed him about old orders. She sniffed. "And Mrs. Pike says the man wanted to know who sends parcels by post. Can you imagine?" The nerve. Other voices joined in. Whispers floated from table to table. Frank Lacey said he asked about delivery slips. Mrs. Pilbeam swears he wanted to see her laundry accounts. And the widow. Oh, the widow. Hargreaves. You should have seen her face when his name came up. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She said nothing, but she noticed the tension. Every villager carried some small irregularity. A debt not recorded. A receipt mislaid. A coin pocketed that should have been declared. Little secrets. Harmless, perhaps, until someone wrote them down in a ledger. Ellery entered then. Neat. Umbrella at his side. Ledger under his arm. He nodded to the room without smiling. Eyes sharp. Measuring. Conversations dipped. Teacups clinked. Everyone watched him cross the room. He ordered tea with exact words. No fuss. No waste. He opened his ledger at the corner table. Pages rustled. Pencil moved. He wrote steadily, ignoring the stares. Mrs. Bantry whispered again. "Look at him. He doesn't even try to hide it." writing names, adding numbers, counting every penny in Street Mary Mead. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Her mind ticked. If he was an auditor, who had sent him? If he was a thief, why so open? And if he was something else entirely, what purpose did the ledger serve? The room buzzed again. One villager slipped out quietly. Another avoided his gaze. Even Dolly Bantry tapped her spoon too fast. Miss Marple rose to fetch more hot water. As she passed Ellery's table, she slowed. Not enough to draw notice, just enough to hear. Ellery's voice was low, measured. He spoke to himself, or perhaps to the page. The widow must never know. Miss Marple kept walking, her teapot steady, her face calm, but inside, her thoughts sharpened like needles. What must the widow never know? And why did Ellery need to remind himself in writing? She returned to her seat. Dolly chattered on. Miss Marple barely heard. Her eyes flicked once more to the ledger, closed now, guarded by Ellery's hand. The fire popped, the rain tapped, and Miss Marple knew something dangerous had just begun. The door to the Blue Boar opened. The wind howled behind it. All heads turned as Widow Hargreaves stepped inside. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and recently bereaved. Her black dress clung to her figure like armor. In one hand she held a thick leather bag heavy with papers. In the other, her walking stick clicked against the floor. Miss Marple watched her enter, calm as ever. She knew the widow well, and she knew what was about to come. Widow Hargreaves didn't waste time. She moved straight to Ellery's table, where he sat, engrossed in his ledger. His sharp eyes glanced up at her. Approach. "Mr. Ellery," she said, her voice cold, sharp. "You've been asking about my late husband's finances." Ellery's fingers paused on the page. The room fell still. He smiled politely. "Just routine," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I'm simply going over old accounts. Nothing to concern yourself with." The widow's lips thinned. "Nothing to concern myself with?" she repeated, her gaze hardening. She set her bag down on the table with a quiet thud. "I know exactly what you're doing." Her voice didn't rise, but it had an edge now. "You're looking for something." Ellery's smile didn't falter, but his fingers tightened on the ledger. "Only what's on the books, Mrs. Hargreaves," he said, pushing the leather cover shut. The widow's eyes flicked to the closed ledger, then back to him. She was calculating. Her mind raced behind her still face. "I've been keeping my husband's accounts for years," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Every penny, every receipt, everything's recorded, every deposit and every debt." Ellery nodded, but his eyes were watchful. "I don't doubt your thoroughness, Mrs. Hargreaves." The widow's hand reached out, fingers hovering near the ledger. "Then why are you asking about the missing funds?" she pressed. "Why are you writing down figures that don't add up?" For the first time, Ellery's calm slipped. His hand twitched as she leaned closer, her breath sharp in the silence. He said nothing for a moment, then finally spoke, but his voice had lost its warmth. "Your husband's debts," he began slowly, "were complicated." "I know," she snapped. Her eyes never left him. "You're after something, aren't you?" Ellery reached for his teacup. He lifted it slowly, carefully. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he said, his tone as smooth as oil, "you have nothing to fear." The widow's eyes flicked back to the ledger. Then, in one swift movement, she grabbed it. She yanked it toward her. Ellery's hand shot out, but it was too late. "I want to see it," she demanded. "Show me the ledger." Ellery's face tightened. For a brief second, he looked like a man caught, but only for a second. He pulled back, his voice colder now. "I'm afraid I can't do that." The widow froze. Her fingers tightened on the ledger. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Ellery set his teacup down. "No one needs to see the ledger. Not yet." His voice was final. The widow's lips parted. She was about to argue when the door creaked again. A voice from the doorway interrupted. Miss Marple had seen enough. She rose slowly, her knitting bag at her side. "I believe Mrs. Hargreaves," she said gently. You've made your point. But the widow's mind was already racing. Her suspicions had deepened. Ellery's calm refusal felt like a hidden trap. And Miss Marple, she knew, would be the one to unlock it. The night settled quickly over Street Mary Mead. The Blue Boar was quiet now. Most of the village had retired for the evening. But not Ellery. Miss Marple had returned from her evening walk. Her steps slowed as she passed the inn. A soft light flickered through the window of the sitting room. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the room's shadowed corners. Ellery sat at a small table, hunched over his ledger. His pencil moved quickly, scratching against the paper. His expression was intense, focused. He was writing something in large, frantic strokes. Miss Marple took a step closer, her footfall soft against the cobblestones. She could just make out the faint outline of the ledger through the window. Ellery had no time for anything but his work. Not even a second to glance up. She turned away, her mind spinning. Curiosity prickled at the back of her thoughts. As she passed the inn's front door, she paused again. The door creaked open just slightly, as though beckoning her in. She stepped inside, her voice a soft whisper. "I thought I might take a moment to chat, Mr. Ellery." He looked up sharply, eyes narrowing for just a second. His hand hovered above the ledger, as if protecting it. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, his voice cool and measured. "Can I offer you some tea?" She shook her head. "No, thank you. I was merely passing through." Ellery returned to his writing. Miss Marple casually moved closer to the table, pretending to admire the inn's decor. Her eyes, however, never left his hands. And that's when she saw it. A small drop of red staining his cuff. Not ink. Something darker. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her knitting bag. She watched him for a moment longer, her mind racing. The red stain was too deliberate, too fresh. She smiled politely and turned to leave. Her heart thudded in her chest. Ellery's hidden past was becoming clearer, but not enough. As she stepped back into the street, she heard the faint sound of a door shutting behind her. She turned, just in time to see Ellery slip out of the inside door. She watched him cross the yard and approach a stone structure at the back of the property. The old strongbox. Widow Hargreaves' strongbox. Ellery unlocked it quickly, his movements swift and practiced. He opened the heavy lid and placed the ledger inside. The lid closed with a solid, final thud. He locked the box with a single turn of the key. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. It was done. The ledger was locked away, hidden from view. Ellery turned and walked back into the inn, leaving the strongbox behind. Miss Marple's mind churned. The red stain, the frantic writing, and now the locked box. What was he hiding, and why did it matter so much? The village was silent that night. The wind had calmed. The streets were empty, save for a few scattered lanterns. But at midnight, the silence was shattered. A scream, loud, desperate. It echoed through the narrow streets, piercing the quiet like a dagger. Miss Marple was already awake. She had been watching the stars from her window when the cry rang out. She heard it clearly. Her mind immediately raced to the Blue Boar. She grabbed her shawl and hurried out the door. As she walked quickly toward the inn, she could see the lights flickering from the windows. The villagers were already gathering outside, murmuring in confusion. Mrs. Bantry was among them, her face pale in the dim light. "What's happened, Jane?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing as she moved forward. Inside the inn there was chaos. The innkeeper was pacing the floor, wringing his hands. A few of the villagers had entered the sitting room, whispering urgently. And there, in the middle of the room, lay Ellery. His body crumpled at the foot of the stairs, his face pale, eyes wide in shock. Miss Marple knelt beside him. There were no signs of struggle, no visible wounds, but something was missing. The ledger. Ellery's hand had been clutching at his coat, but there was no trace of the thick leather book. It was gone. "Where is it?" Miss Marple muttered to herself, her thoughts racing. The innkeeper nodded toward the counter. "It was there when I left. I swear it was. I thought I heard him writing in it just before the cry." The villagers murmured, exchanging nervous glances. Miss Marple rose slowly, her face calm, but her mind in turmoil. She turned and surveyed the room. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had left. Ellery had been alone. And now the ledger was gone. "Is he dead?" Mrs. Bantry asked quietly, stepping forward. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, he's gone." The innkeeper wrung his hands. "But who did this? Who?" Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. "We don't know yet." She paused, her eyes flicking toward the door. "And we need to find that ledger." A voice cut through the tension. It was Widow Hargreaves. She had appeared at the doorway, her face as sharp as ever. Her black dress and walking stick were familiar, but tonight her expression was something else, something darker. "I never left my house," she said firmly, her voice icy. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The widow's words had an edge. She stepped forward slowly, the room falling silent. Her eyes met Widow Hargreaves's. "Of course," Miss Marple replied softly. "But that doesn't explain where the ledger has gone." The widow's lips tightened. "I never left my house," she repeated, louder this time. Her eyes flicked nervously to the door, then back to Miss Marple. Miss Marple studied her closely. There was something about the widow's tone, something that didn't sit right. The ledger was gone, and the widow was hiding something. The sound of a carriage cut through the early morning. Miss Marple was already on her way to the inn, drawn by the whispers in the air. By the time she arrived, the inn was a hive of activity. Inspector Slack had arrived. He was tall, his coat flapping as he stepped out of the carriage. His expression was gruff, his steps heavy. The villagers stood back as he entered, allowing him space to work. Slack took one look at Ellery's body, still sprawled on the floor. He scowled and adjusted his cap. "Accident," he muttered. "No need to get all worked up. Looks like a robbery gone wrong." The innkeeper nodded, wringing his hands. "Yes, sir. That's what I thought. The ledger's missing, and I heard a scream. Didn't know what happened until I came down and found him." Slack raised his eyebrow, as if it all made perfect sense. He waved the innkeeper away and turned to the group of villagers who had gathered in the doorway. "Everyone stand back. No need to." Crowd. Miss Marple stood to the side, quietly watching. Her gaze never wavered from the inspector. She wasn't convinced. A robbery? It didn't fit. The inn was quiet, too quiet for a break-in. No signs of a struggle. Nothing overturned, nothing moved. And the ledger was too important to leave behind. Slack began pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He muttered to himself, then turned toward the innkeeper. "Have you checked the rooms?" The innkeeper nodded quickly. "Already did, sir. No sign of anyone. I haven't had time to look in the back yet, but it's clear the man was alone." "Good," Slack grumbled. He glanced at Miss Marple as though noticing her for the first time. "I suppose you have something to add, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "I've seen enough." She stepped closer to the body, her fingers lightly brushing the floor. The scene didn't make sense, but there was something small, something hidden that caught her eye. She approached the window latch. There, on the edge of the window frame, was a faint mark, a smear of wax, barely visible in the dim light. Her fingers hovered over it, but she didn't touch it. She studied it carefully. It was recent. It hadn't been there long. Miss Marple's mind raced. The window was shut tight, but someone had been there. Someone had tampered with the latch. Slack, noticing her movement, strode over. "What's this?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes never left the mark. "This isn't an accident," she murmured, almost to herself. Slack chuckled. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's always a mystery, isn't it?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "A robbery gone wrong?" she repeated. "Or something else entirely?" Slack didn't answer. He bent down to examine the mark, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple stood silently, watching him. There was no point in arguing. She knew what she had seen, and she wasn't going to let him dismiss it so easily. The air inside the Blue Boar was heavy with uncertainty. The villagers had retreated, leaving Miss Marple alone with the widow. Her black dress was a stark contrast against the room's muted shadows. Widow Hargreaves stood near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her face, usually sharp and composed, now seemed frail, as though age had caught up with her in a moment of weakness. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. But there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Miss Marple watched her, quietly observant. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she began softly, "you mentioned earlier that Mr. Ellery had borrowed your spare key." The widow nodded. "Yes, he asked for it. For study." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered. She turned toward the small table near the window, her fingers brushing the edges of the keyring on the side. "Study," Miss Marple repeated. "And did he explain what exactly he was studying?" The widow's lips pressed together. "No, only that he needed it for access to the ledgers, for some of my late husband's papers." "Did you find that odd?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing. Widow Hargreaves hesitated for just a moment before replying. "It seemed reasonable enough. He was an accountant after all. But—" She stopped, looking down at the floor. Miss Marple waited. "But?" The widow sighed, a tired, almost defeated sound. "But it's not just the ledger I'm worried about now. It's the way he left." She paused, her voice lowering. "He left with the key in his pocket, but without a word of thanks. It felt—" She trailed off, but Miss Marple understood. "It felt too purposeful, too deliberate." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the widow's strongbox. It stood in the corner of the room, its old brass lock gleaming faintly in the low light. "May I?" she asked, nodding toward the box. The widow hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but the ledger isn't there anymore." Miss Marple moved over to the box, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She unlocked it slowly, deliberately. Inside, she found the familiar stacks of papers, account books, ledgers, receipts. But there was something else. A small, crumpled piece of paper. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. It was torn at the edges, as though it had been hastily discarded. She flattened it with her fingers. One word was written on the scrap. "Forged." The room seemed to freeze. The widow's eyes widened. "That wasn't there before," she said, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's mind raced. The word forged was too deliberate, too specific. It wasn't just about the missing ledger anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been hidden until now. She turned the paper over, but there was nothing more, just the single word. The widow stood frozen, watching Miss Marple. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She had no answers. Miss Marple placed the scrap back into the box. Her eyes met the widow's. "There's more to this than you're telling me," she said quietly. "We'll get to the bottom of it. I'm sure of that." The village had a way of sharing secrets, even when no one was speaking. Miss Marple stood in line at the grocer's, listening as the whispers spread from one person to the next. The chatter was quiet at first, but it grew louder. "Did you hear? Ellery was a blackmailer, they say. Everyone's got something to hide, haven't they? Accounts, debts, old promises." The whispers clung to the air, thickening the space between each word. Miss Marple kept her place, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. She had learned long ago that in small villages, every conversation was a clue. Mrs. Dodds, the butcher's wife, leaned in close. "Frank Lacey," said Ellery, had a list of names. "What sort of list?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but sharp. Mrs. Dodds lowered her voice. "People who owed, people who couldn't pay." She nodded slowly. Ellery was helping them, but for a price, of course. "Blackmail?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Dodds looked around before nodding. "Exactly. Frank says he threatened to expose everything if they didn't pay up." Her voice was low, but the words spread through the shop like wildfire. The grocer, Mr. Collins, overheard the exchange. His face tightened, and he quickly moved away to stock the shelves. The gossip simmered in the air. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to the back of the shop, where the shopkeeper, Mr. Danks, was arranging a new batch of flour. She had always found Danks to be a bit too eager to please, but today something was different. As the gossip grew louder, Danks grew quieter. He became oddly defensive, moving quickly to refill his jars, avoiding eye contact with the villagers. "People have said worse about him," Danks muttered, his voice sharp, as though trying to shut the conversation down. Ellery wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a blackmailer. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. She didn't buy it. There was more to this than Danks was willing to admit. As she reached for a loaf of bread, something caught her eye. A small slip of paper fluttered from Danks's pocket. It hit the floor with a soft thud. Miss Marple bent down to pick it up. She could feel Danks's eyes on her, burning into her back. He was watching her closely. The slip of paper was torn, a small piece of laundry receipt. But there was something familiar about it. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of the torn slip. The handwriting was faint, but legible. It had a name on it. Pilbeam. Miss Marple's mind clicked. The laundress. The one who handled all the villagers' clothes. The slip was old, worn from being carried around, and the way it had fallen from Danks's pocket didn't seem accidental. She raised her eyes to Danks, who was now watching her intently. He shifted uneasily on his feet. "I don't know how that got there," he muttered quickly. "It's nothing. Just old business. Nothing to worry about." Miss Marple didn't speak. She held the slip loosely in her fingers, her gaze never leaving Danks's face. The room felt colder, the air heavier. And Danks, he was hiding something. Miss Marple stood in the doorway of the grocer's, the torn laundry slip still clutched between her fingers. The air in the shop felt thick, as though everyone was holding their breath. Danks hadn't moved. The villagers murmured quietly amongst themselves, but Miss Marple didn't hear them. Her mind was focused on the small slip of paper. She knew the handwriting. She recognized the markings. It was from the Pilbeam laundry. Pilbeam's was the oldest laundry in the village. Everything, every shirt, every sheet, every blouse went through their hands. No one else's work was as clean, as polished, as perfect. And no one's records were as meticulous. The slip had been torn in half, but enough of the print was visible. A faint name, Pilbeam, was scrawled across the top. Miss Marple didn't need to read any further to know where it had come from. Danks was avoiding her eyes. He was standing by the counter, his hands fumbling with a jar of sugar, but his gaze kept darting back to the slip in her hands. Miss Marple folded the paper slowly, her thoughts running faster than her hands. The slip wasn't just a laundry receipt, it was a link. Ellery had been tied to Pilbeam. Perhaps not directly, but definitely indirectly. What had he been doing at the laundry? And why had he been receiving these slips if he wasn't involved in the financial mess that had now begun to unravel? "Mr. Danks," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm, "I believe this. Slip is far more important than it seems." Danks stiffened at the mention of his name. He looked up, but his eyes betrayed him. "Nothing to it," he muttered, his voice too quick. "It's just old business. A few things misplaced." Miss Marple held up the slip, her fingers tracing the faint print of the Pilbeam name. "I suspect this connects Mr. Ellery to something far more suspicious than a simple laundry order," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I think Ellery was using the laundry as a cover for cleaning up something far more serious." Danks's face blanched, his eyes flickering nervously to the door, to the window, as though looking for an escape. But there was no way out. Not this time. Miss Marple stepped closer, her calm demeanor unsettling in the quiet room. "We're not talking about a missing shirt, are we, Mr. Danks?" she said softly. "No, we're talking about financial transactions. A cover for something far darker." Danks's breath hitched. He took a step back, his hand clutching the counter to steady himself. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice tight. "Ellery was just asking about the accounts, that's all. Just checking things. Nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. She could feel the tension rising. Danks was lying. But why? The slip was crucial. It had come from the laundry, but how had it ended up in Danks's pocket? It was the kind of mistake no one would make if they weren't involved. Miss Marple stared at the slip in her hand one last time, then turned to leave. But before she stepped out of the shop, her gaze fell on the slip again. A faint green stain marked the bottom of the paper. It was barely noticeable, But it was there. A stain that couldn't have come from the laundry. The green ink was fresh. It had been added recently. And that meant one thing. It had been placed there on purpose. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She knew this was the key. But the question was, what did the green ink mean? The morning was quiet, but something felt off. Miss Marple had just returned from a walk when she found the note waiting for her at the vicarage doorstep. It was tucked under the mat, half hidden as though someone had been in a hurry. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cold parchment. The note was plain, simple, with no writing, just an address. Vicarage. Attention. Miss Marple. A chill crept down her spine. Her instincts told her that this was no ordinary note, and her suspicions were confirmed as soon as she opened it. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was the missing ledger, the same leather-bound book she had seen in Ellery's hands days before. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat as she carefully unwrapped the book. It was the exact same one, but it had been tampered with. The pages were smeared, as if someone had hurriedly tried to erase certain sections. The writing was still legible, but there were large gaps where numbers had been crossed out. It was as though someone had tried to hide the truth. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, her fingers skimming over the entries. The accounts were filled with irregularities, notes that didn't make sense, names crossed out and replaced with others. There was no pattern, no logic, just chaos. But one entry stood out. In the back, near the final pages, was a line that had not been touched. It read clearly, unmistakably, "Debt owed by D." Miss Marple stopped, her eyes locked on the name. It wasn't finished, but the implication was clear. D meant something. Someone. Her mind raced. Danks? Could it be him? She had seen him so defensive when the laundry slip fell from his pocket. And now the ledger had reappeared at her doorstep with his name barely concealed. What had Ellery known about Danks that no one else did? Miss Marple flipped through the pages again, but the rest was just as illegible. The numbers were all crossed out. The entries had been erased as if someone was covering their tracks. She placed the ledger down carefully. The mystery was deepening, but the missing pieces were starting to fall into place. The question was, who had sent the ledger? And why had it been hidden until now? The vicar was unsettled. When Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage that afternoon, she found him pacing in his study. Reverend Haydock's glasses were perched on the edge of his nose, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "Miss Marple, this is most perplexing," he said, rubbing his temple. "I simply can't understand why someone would drop that ledger at my doorstep." Miss Marple sat down calmly across from him. "I'm sure it's been causing you some distress." The vicar nodded. "I thought at first it was some sort of mistake. A lost package, perhaps. But then I realized there was nothing to explain why it was addressed to me. No note, no explanation. Just the ledger." Miss Marple watched him closely. "I assume you've never seen it before?" "Never," he replied quickly. "It's not a book I've ever had any business with, and I certainly don't know anything about its contents." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Then why do you think it was left here, Reverend?" The vicar hesitated. He glanced at the ledger, still wrapped in the brown paper, resting on the desk between them. "I can only guess," he said slowly. "It must have been meant to appear respectable, to make it seem as though someone with honor had left it here. Someone who wanted it to be found in a place of trust." Miss Marple nodded, her mind working quickly. A clever tactic. By leaving the ledger with the vicar, it would gain credibility. The ledger itself wasn't just a collection of accounts. It was a tool, a message. But a message for whom? And why now? The vicar continued to fidget, clearly unsettled by the entire situation. "There's one other thing," he said, suddenly looking up. "I've been wondering about this all day. Last night, when I was out for my evening walk, I saw someone." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Who did you see, Reverend?" "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it's been bothering me." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "It was Iris Pilbeam." Miss Marple blinked. "Iris Pilbeam?" The vicar nodded. "Yes. She was walking down the lane near my house. It was late past 10 o'clock, I'd say. She seemed distracted. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, with all this, it doesn't sit right. Miss Marple's mind raced. Iris Pilbeam, the laundress. She had been a part of this puzzle from the start. But what was Iris doing walking by the vicarage at that hour? And why hadn't anyone noticed? "Why did you not mention this earlier?" Miss Marple asked. "I didn't think it was important," the vicar replied, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "I didn't see any reason to bring it up. But now, with everything that's happening, I'm beginning to wonder if it's a key piece." Miss Marple rose from her chair slowly, her mind already working out the next steps. "I think you're right, Reverend. It is important." And with that, the pieces began to fall into place. Iris Pilbeam, the laundress, out late at night near the vicarage. The ledger delivered to the vicar's door. Everything was starting to connect. But the real question was, what had Iris seen, and what was she hiding? Iris Pilbeam was nervous when Miss Marple arrived at the laundry. Her hands trembled as she folded a pile of freshly pressed sheets. She hadn't expected a visit from Miss Marple. Not today, not after everything that had happened. The moment Miss Marple stepped into the small laundry room, the tension in the air was palpable. Iris' eyes darted around, avoiding direct contact. She didn't greet Miss Marple, just nodded curtly. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, taking in the smell of freshly washed linen, the faint scent of lavender. It was a scene of domestic calm, yet the unease in the air made everything feel off balance. "I'm afraid I need to ask you some questions, Iris," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I believe you were out late last night, near the vicarage." Iris's breath hitched. She stiffened, her fingers pausing in their work. I wasn't doing anything wrong," she stammered, her voice shaky. "I was just walking home. I didn't think anyone would notice." "I'm sure you didn't," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft. "But it's important, Iris. Did you happen to have something with you last night? A parcel, perhaps?" Iris looked down at the ground, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a towel. She swallowed hard, then spoke in a low voice. "I was carrying something. Yes, a parcel. But it wasn't mine. I didn't know what it was." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "What was in the parcel, Iris?" I thought it was just laundry," Iris said quickly, her eyes flicking to the side. "Just some clothes to be picked up. I thought someone had dropped it off for cleaning, that's all." "But it wasn't. It wasn't just laundry, was it?" Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "The parcel. It wasn't just laundry. Who gave it to you?" she asked gently but firmly. Iris hesitated. Her eyes darted to the window, then back at Miss Marple. I don't know. Someone just handed it to me and told me to take it. They said it was for cleaning. I didn't think it was anything special." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "Iris, this is important. You must tell me everything you know. Who gave you the parcel?" Iris's eyes filled with fear. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as though trying to decide whether to speak or remain silent. After a long moment, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "It was tied with Danks's red thread string." Miss Marple froze. Her mind spun. Danks, the shopkeeper, the man who had been so defensive when Miss Marple had questioned him. Why had he given Iris a parcel? What did it contain? Iris's admission sent a chill through the room. She stepped back from the counter, her hands shaking. "I didn't want to get involved," she whispered almost to herself. "I didn't want to know. But now, with everything happening, I don't know who else to turn to." Miss Marple stood still, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Danks had been involved, more than anyone realized. But what was the connection between Danks and Ellery, and why had Iris been the one to carry the parcel? Inspector Slack was in no mood for pleasantries. He arrived at the shop with the authority of a man who thought he already knew the answers. Danks stood behind the counter, visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he adjusted a row of jars. Slack wasted no time. He stepped forward, his voice harsh. "You know why I'm here, Danks." Danks swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know anything, Inspector. I've told you everything already. Slack leaned in, his eyes cold and calculating. Funny how you've told me nothing about that ledger, and yet you're the one who seemed most interested in it. His voice dropped. And I'm curious, how exactly does the widow Hargreaves fit into all of this? Danks flinched. The question hit him harder than he expected. He shifted, his eyes darting toward the door, as though looking for an escape. But there was no way out now. She's got nothing to do with it. Danks spat, his voice rising. I told you already. She's the one with the debts, not me. She's the one who was hiding things. Slack's gaze hardened. Tell me again. Danks, why did you give Iris Pilbeam that parcel last night? And why did you leave the laundry slip in your pocket? Danks hesitated. His eyes narrowed, but the sweat on his brow was obvious. He was caught, and he knew it. I didn't give her the parcel. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, stumbling over his own words. The widow Hargreaves. She's the one who sent me to do things. She always tried to get me to help with her problems. She was always borrowing money, you know. Slack stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. You're a liar, Danks. Everyone in this village knows you've been more than just a shopkeeper. You've been involved in something bigger. Tell me the truth. Danks's face turned red, his eyes darting around, unable to meet Slack's gaze. I didn't mean any harm, he muttered, almost pleading now. It's just business. Business I've been stuck in. I've been helping people, you see. People who needed a little extra help with their finances. People who didn't want the rest of the village to know. Miss Marple stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching the exchange. She had been silent up until now, but she had noticed something. Danks's shirt sleeve caught her eye. A faint residue of starch, clearly visible under the dim light. It wasn't just a stain, it was too fresh, too deliberate. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Danks, she said softly, you've been handling more than just laundry, haven't you? Danks stiffened, his eyes widening for a split second. He looked at her, then quickly turned away. I don't know what you mean, he muttered, but his voice shook. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she studied him. The starch was a small detail, but it was enough. It was a sign that he had been handling something far more than the ordinary goods in his shop. And with the way he was avoiding the truth, Miss Marple knew. Danks was hiding something, and whatever it was linked to the death of Ellery. Miss Marple had been methodical in her questioning of the widow, but something still didn't sit right. The timeline didn't add up. Widow Hargreaves had claimed she spent the evening at home, quietly knitting by the fire. But there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't align. Miss Marple walked the familiar path to the widow's house. She had already spoken with the neighbours, each offering little snippets of information. The same story, with slight variations. As Miss Marple entered the house, she could almost feel the weight of the widow's alibi hanging in the air. The fire was still warm, and a half-knitted scarf lay on the armchair just as the widow had described. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She had learned long ago that appearances often hid the truth. Mrs. Hargreaves, Miss Marple began, her voice calm but firm. I've checked the timeline. You say you were home knitting all evening. The widow's expression remained unchanged, but there was a slight twitch in her eye. Yes, that's correct. I've been here all evening. I told you. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning the pieces over. The neighbour, Mrs. Pike, said the light in your room went out unusually early. The widow stiffened. Mrs. Pike doesn't know what she's talking about. I was here, alone, and the light went out at my usual time. Miss Marple watched her closely. She said the light went out well before 10, well before you claimed to have gone to bed. There was a moment's hesitation, a flicker of doubt in the widow's eyes. Miss Marple had seen it. It was small, but it was there. Well, I suppose Mrs. Pike could have mistaken the time, the widow muttered. People are always looking for things to gossip about in this village. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, letting the tension grow. Then she stepped closer to the widow's table, glancing at the candlesticks by the fire. The widow had said she'd been knitting by the fire all evening, but something caught Miss Marple's eye. Fresh wax. A small, glistening drop of wax had dripped down the side of the candlestick. The wax was still soft, still freshly fallen. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over it. The wax had been recently disturbed. The candle had been lit too recently. She turned to face the widow. "Mrs. Hargreaves, this wax is fresh. Too fresh. You claim to have been knitting, but the candle wasn't burning at the time, you said." The widow's face flushed crimson. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's eyes never left the widow. "There's no reason to lie about something so small. But when the little things don't add up, we must ask what else is being hidden." The widow stepped back, a flash of panic crossing her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The room felt colder now, the weight of the widow's silence heavy in the air. Miss Marple knew one thing for sure. The widow's alibi had cracked, and the truth was starting to emerge. The news came from Dr. Haydock, of all people. He arrived at the vicarage early that morning, looking weary but determined. Miss Marple met him in the hallway, her eyes sharp as ever. "You found something, Doctor?" she asked quietly. Dr. Haydock nodded, a frown etched on his face. "It's about Ellery's hands. I noticed something odd when I examined him last night." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Odd?" "Odd indeed," he replied. "The ink stains on his fingers weren't like anything I've seen before. It was faint, but definitely noticeable." He hesitated. Those stains weren't the usual kind of ink he would have been using for accounts. It looked different. Miss Marple's mind clicked. Different. How? It was green, the doctor explained. A fresh stain, and it was smeared. Not the kind of ink you'd get from writing in a ledger. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, processing the information. Green ink? Not ordinary ink. This was something deliberate. "The ledger," she murmured. The green ink was a crucial clue. It couldn't be a coincidence. "It means the ledger had been tampered with," Dr. Haydock continued. "It wasn't just his death that was suspicious. Someone had already altered the book before his death. And the ink wasn't from Ellery's usual pen." Miss Marple's mind was already racing. She stepped toward the table, where the earlier evidence of the ledger still lay. Who had tampered with it? Why the green ink? She knew the answer was somewhere close. Everything was connected. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, her voice firm. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "There's one more thing I need to check. I must speak to the widow's maid." The widow's house was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. The maid, a young woman named Elsie, was scrubbing the hearth. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face pale. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Elsie said softly. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the rag she had been using. "Elsie," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "I've heard something rather strange. I understand you've been cleaning the hearth recently." Elsie's eyes flickered nervously. I clean it every morning, miss. The widow likes everything spotless." Miss Marple stepped closer. "I'm sure she does." She paused. "But I've heard you've been scrubbing something unusual. The green ink stains, for instance." Elsie's face drained of colour. She looked away, swallowing hard. "Yes, miss. I scrubbed it off. There was ink, green ink, all over the hearth. It wouldn't come off easily, but I made sure it was clean." Miss Marple's heart raced. Green ink on the hearth, and the maid had been the one to clean it. Miss Marple studied Elsie carefully. The maid was hiding something. But what? The room was quiet as Miss Marple stood before the widow's strongbox. The thick leather ledger rested on the table beside her, its pages still smeared with ink. Ellery's death was no longer a mystery, but the details were beginning to unravel. Miss Marple turned the ledger over slowly in her hands. The book, which had seemed like the key to everything, now felt like a trap. The pieces were falling into place. "Ellery never locked this ledger inside the strongbox," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but steady. She glanced at the widow, who stood in the corner of the room, her eyes wide. That was the trick. The widow's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. Miss Marple lifted the ledger slightly, showing the widow the back cover. There was no need to lock it. The killer didn't want anyone to think the ledger had been tampered with. She paused for a moment, letting the silence settle in the air. Instead, they planted the scrap of paper inside, the one with the word forged written on it. The widow swallowed. That wasn't Ellery's doing, was it? She asked softly, fear creeping into her voice. Miss Marple shook her head. No. Ellery's handwriting would never have been so careless. He would never have written such a word in the middle of a ledger entry. It was placed there by someone who wanted to frame him. The widow's hands trembled, her grip tightening around the edge of the chair. But why would anyone do that? And why leave it with me? Miss Marple glanced back at the strongbox. That's the question, isn't it? She said quietly. If Ellery had been alive, he would have kept this ledger locked away. She paused, looking directly at the widow. The killer had to make sure it appeared as though Ellery was responsible for the mess. But the truth is, the ledger was altered after his death. Miss Marple set the ledger back down gently. Someone changed the entries, covered up the traces, and when they did, they made sure to plant the clue to mislead us. The widow was silent, her gaze flicking between Miss Marple and the ledger. It was all too much for her to grasp. Miss Marple studied the scrap of paper once more, her eyes tracing the word forged. It seemed like an obvious clue, but there was something more. She reached into her bag, pulling out a fresh piece of paper. With a steady hand, she wrote down the word forged, exactly as it appeared on the scrap. Then, she compared it with Ellery's handwriting in the ledger. The letters didn't match, but the scrap's handwriting there was something familiar about it. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes flicking over the words again. Ellery never wrote this, but I think I know who did. She turned to the widow, who was now staring at her in disbelief. It's Danks, Miss Marple said quietly. The handwriting on that scrap matches Danks's handwriting, not Ellery's. The widow gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No, she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. Are you sure? Miss Marple nodded. I'm sure. And now we know who was behind all of this. But the question remains, why did he do it? The air in the room grew colder, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. Danks had been involved all along. But what had driven him to commit murder and frame Ellery? Miss Marple had spent the afternoon reviewing the alibis. It wasn't the most thrilling task, but it was necessary. Each suspect had claimed to be somewhere at the time of Ellery's death, but none of their stories were solid. The widow had insisted she was home, knitting by the fire, just as she'd said. But Miss Marple had already heard from Mrs. Pike that the widow's light went out too early. Danks, on the other hand, claimed he was in his shop all evening, preparing for the morning rush. But Miss Marple had noticed how he had fidgeted when she asked him about the ledger. He seemed too eager to prove his innocence. Iris Pilbeam had been out running errands, according to her. But what errands? She'd admitted to being near the vicarage the night of the murder, and Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Each alibi seemed shaky. Each one had holes that were too big to ignore. And the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces began to look like a trap. She sat quietly at the widow's table, glancing over the notes she had made throughout the day. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the otherwise still room. The widow sat across from her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was unnervingly calm. Her face was impassive, but Miss Marple could sense the anxiety lurking beneath her composed exterior. "I've gone over everything," Miss Marple said softly. "I've spoken with the neighbors, I've checked the times, and nothing adds up." The widow nodded but didn't speak. Her gaze shifted to the floor. "I've asked about all of you, Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple continued. "And all of your alibis are shaky. The timing doesn't match up. Someone is lying." The widow's lips pressed together. She said nothing, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as though considering how best to respond. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room once more. Then, her gaze fell on the space beneath the widow's table. She had seen something, a faint glimmer caught in the low light. She reached under the table carefully, her fingers brushing against something small. A piece of thread, faintly coated in wax. She pulled it out slowly, her heart racing. The thread was familiar. It was the same red thread that had been used to tie the parcel Iris had carried the night of Ellery's death. Miss Marple held the thread up, her eyes sharp. It was coated with fresh wax, just like the wax she had seen on the widow's candlestick earlier. The connection was undeniable now. The widow had been more involved than she had let on, and this thread was a clue that could unravel everything. The widow's face turned pale as she saw what Miss Marple had found. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped herself. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "this thread doesn't lie." The widow's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Miss Marple. Her lips trembled. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Miss Marple stood in the widow's study, the ledger open in front of her. The entries were clearer now, each one marking a debt owed by the widow's late husband, Samuel Hargreaves. There were names, dozens of them, and amounts listed with precision. The debts were extensive. It was clear that Samuel had borrowed from nearly everyone in the village. Some amounts were small, just a few pounds here and there, but others were substantial, enough to raise suspicion. Miss Marple's fingers traced the columns, her eyes narrowing. There were some familiar names on the list. Danks, of course, but also Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock. All had lent Samuel money, though none had spoken of it. It wasn't unusual for people in the village to borrow from each other, but the scale of Samuel's debts was alarming. And the most troubling part was that the payments had stopped shortly before his death. "Widow Hargreaves," Miss Marple said quietly, "your late husband had many debts, more than I believe you've admitted." The widow stood behind her, her fingers clutching the back of her chair as though trying to steady herself. Her face had gone pale. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't want anyone to know how deep in debt he was." Miss Marple looked up from the ledger, her gaze sharp. "He was borrowing from everyone, wasn't he? And now you're left to clean up the mess." The widow turned away, her face flushing with anger. "I didn't ask for any of this. Samuel didn't ask for it either. He thought he could keep everything hidden. But now you're making it worse." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not making it worse, Mrs. Hargreaves. I'm trying to help you understand what happened." The widow spun around, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think you understand?" she hissed. "You think it's just about money. Ellery was the one who was going to expose everything. All of it. The debts, the lies, the shame." Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Ellery was going to expose you?" she asked, her voice low. The widow's breath quickened, her chest rising and falling with each sharp inhale. "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him ruin me. You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to live like that, with all those people whispering behind your back, judging you for things you didn't even do." Miss Marple remained silent, allowing the widow to vent. The pieces were coming together now. Ellery had found out about the debts, and he had been preparing to expose them. It wasn't just the ledger that had led to his death, it was the threat he posed to the widow's reputation. "He was about to ruin me," the widow cried, her voice breaking. "He was going to tell everyone about the debts, about how Samuel had dragged me into this mess. He would have destroyed me." Miss Marple stepped back, her gaze softening. The widow's words had a ring of truth to them. She wasn't just angry, she was terrified. And when people were scared, they did things they might regret. Miss Marple knew it now. The widow had more to hide than anyone realized. But the real question was, how far would she go to protect her secret? The room at Bantry House was filled with tension. Villagers stood in small, nervous clusters, glancing from one to the other. They had all been summoned by Miss Marple, and now they were here, waiting. Miss Marple sat at the head of the table, her calm demeanor belying the storm that was about to unfold. Her sharp eyes scanned the faces of those present. Danks, the widow, Iris Pilbeam, and the rest of the village. Each one had a role to play in the mystery, and Miss Marple had already pieced together most of the puzzle. The widow fidgeted, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Danks stood by the window, his face a mask of frustration, as though trying to avoid being caught. Iris shifted uneasily in her seat, looking guilty but unsure why she was there. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. "I've gathered you all here because the truth cannot remain hidden any longer," she began, her voice steady. "The truth about Ellery's death, about the ledger, and about the lies that have been keeping this village in the dark." The room fell silent. Every eye was on Miss Marple now. She knew the villagers were all wondering the same thing: who had done it. Miss Marple looked down at the ledger, resting on the table before her. She picked it up, turning the pages slowly. The ledger, as we know, was altered after Ellery's death. But that's not all. She paused, letting the silence stretch. The first clue was the wax, the fresh wax on the widow's candlestick. It was a small detail, but it was enough. The candle had been recently disturbed, and it was linked to something far more significant than just a night of knitting. She glanced around the room, her gaze settling on the widow. You see, the widow's alibi was built on lies. She claimed she was home knitting, but the timeline didn't match. The neighbors had already seen the light in her room go out too early, and that wasn't the only thing that didn't add up. Miss Marple turned to Danks. The laundry slip. It had a familiar name on it. Pilbeam. You all remember the parcel Iris carried that night, don't you? It was tied with Danks's red thread string. But why would Danks's string be found on a parcel Iris didn't even know she was delivering? Danks's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple raised a hand to silence him. "Not yet, mister?" "Danks." She turned back to the group, her voice gaining strength. The next clue was the false delivery. Someone had arranged for the parcel to be carried to the widow's house, but not by Ellery. It was all part of the plan to make it appear as though Ellery had taken the ledger and hidden it away. A distraction. A diversion. She set the ledger down with a soft thud. And now we come to the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her gaze turning cold. The widow, Mrs. Hargreaves, staged the robbery. She knew Ellery had discovered the debts, and she knew he was about to expose everything. So, in an act of desperation, she killed him to silence him. The room was deathly still. The widow's eyes widened, her lips parted in shock. No, I didn't." Miss Marple pointed directly at her. "You staged the robbery to make it look like someone was after the ledger. You planted the forged scrap in the book. You made sure the villagers saw the ledger as evidence of Ellery's involvement. But it was all a lie." The widow's face turned a sickly shade of pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The truth had been revealed. The village would never be the same again. The village was quiet once more. The trial was over. Justice had been served. Widow Hargreaves was escorted out of the room, her head held high, but her eyes wild with fury. She protested, her voice rising in the still air. "I didn't kill him," she cried. "I didn't. He was going to ruin me, but I never—" The constables didn't stop her. They simply kept walking, their grip firm but respectful. She was taken away, her protests fading as she disappeared into the carriage that would carry her to her fate. Danks stood near the window, his shoulders slumped. Relief washed over him, but it was clear he wasn't free of guilt. The truth had come out, and while his involvement in the crime had been exposed, he was no longer the primary target. The widow's confession had lifted the weight from his shoulders, but it had cost him his peace of mind. Iris Pilbeam sat nearby, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't been an innocent bystander, but she wasn't a killer either. She had been caught up in something much larger than herself. Now, she could only watch as the others around her dealt with the consequences. Miss Marple stood at the back of the room, her eyes focused on the quiet scene before her. The village had been torn apart by lies, by secrets, by debts. But now, at least for a moment, there was peace. The weight of the investigation lifted from her shoulders. She had seen this before, the small, hidden sins that built up over time, the lies people told themselves to survive. In a village like Street Mary Mead, nothing stayed hidden for long. Miss Marple looked out the window, her gaze thoughtful. "Money stains everything," she said softly to herself, almost as if speaking to the wind. "Even laundry." Her words hung in the air, a reflection of the truth she had uncovered. It wasn't just about debts and ledgers. It was about what people would do to protect themselves, how far they would go to hide their shame. And then she added, almost as a final thought, murder never hides long in a village. The village had learned its lesson. The truth had been revealed. But some truths were harder to accept than others. And for those who had been touched by the darkness of this case, it would take a long time before the scars healed. Miss Marple turned away from the window, her gaze focused once more. Justice had been done, and now Street Mary Mead could finally breathe again.